You're listening to WRI's Big Ideas into Action podcast, and we want to welcome you to the first episode of Turning Up Clean Energy in Asia. Throughout this series, we'll cover how research projects led by World Resources Institute, or WRI for short, accelerate the clean energy transition in China, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. My name is Florinda Wibowo, Senior Manager of Energy and Sustainable Business here at WRI Indonesia. I'll be your host for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. The Climate Solution Partnership, or referred as CSP, is collaboration between WRI, the World Wildlife Fund or WWF, and HSBC. HSBC also funds the CSP. WRI-led CSP projects aim to break down barriers to private finance investing in renewable energy, build up capacity to decarbonize supply chains, and bring together stakeholders who can reimagine the private sector's role in transforming the energy sector while implementing resource-based solutions. Before we begin, we must acknowledge the historical context of global energy. The United States and European countries kicked off the Industrial Revolutions around 1850, and through the first 100 years, they were responsible for a vast majority of GHG emissions, according to WRI's own Climate Watch. Then, they offshored much of their manufacturing needs to other countries around the world, shifting the climate burden to those countries which were looking to provide for their own growing populations, all while helping meet the demands of increasing consumption in Western countries in an increasingly unregulated world. We will focus on the 4 CSP countries: China, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. According to data from the World Bank, the 4 CSP countries are among the largest manufacturing countries in the world, producing things for locals with newfound wealth who are looking to increase their quality of life and producing critical parts for global brands that move their supply chains to Asia. Such rapid economic development led to an equally rapid increase in demand for energy and thus GHG emission. Since 1990, the percentage of global GHG emissions in the 4 CSP countries has more than doubled, based on data collected and analyzed by WRI, accounting for more than a third of the world's GHG emission in that time span. While this pales in comparison to historical emission produced by the likes of the US and other European countries, the region, like the rest of the world, sits at the crossroads. The continual influx of cash to the region could fund more fossil fuel infrastructure or spur on the clean energy transition. Take China, which makes up 53% of global coal use according to the International Energy Agency, which accounts for 70% of its total emissions. And yet, China plans to build a mind-blogging 3,100 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. According to a recent report from Climate Analytics, China and India are engaged in a spree of coal-fired power plant construction, but Asia is also only region broadly on track to triple renewables by 2030, the agreed-upon goal set by countries at COP28 in 2023. In fact, the report asserts that tripling renewable energy is possibly the most powerful action the world can take in the transition away from fossil fuels in this critical decade. One other point sticks out from the report. The transition will cost money, a lot of it. From this year, 2024, all the way through 2030, annual spending on renewable energy expansion needs to double from the current $1 trillion mark. How and where will this money materialize? That's where the CSP comes in. In each episode, you learn about the details of the projects, that are poised to scale the private sector role in accelerating the clean energy transition. You'll hear from the WI researchers behind each project, as well as some of our partners and outside experts. Most of all, we hope that you'll understand that the role of each country can play in bringing this data-backed solution to commercial viability. Thank you to HSBC for funding the CSP and our colleagues at WWF for their partnership in research and implementation of the projects. Speaking of those projects, it's time to look at the big picture of how Asia became a manufacturing powerhouse and what that means for the clean energy transition on the continent. Joining us to talk about the history of energy in Asia is Justin Wu, the Asia Pacific co-head of climate change for HSBC, and Denny Suryadi, the acting manager of sustainable and renewable energy for ASEAN Center for Energy. We are also thrilled to be joined by Deepak Krishnan, WRI India's Deputy Director of the Energy Program. So welcome to all the speakers to the podcast. So Asia is home to rapidly growing manufacturing industries. How have these industries been operating in line with sustainable principles, or they have not? Maybe I'm going to send this first question to Deepak, as I know that WRI India has been working a lot on the industrial decarbonization project as well. So over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Inda, for the question, and great to be on this panel discussion. So Asia is a growing region, and many types of industries are setting up base. Folks who are already there are also expanding their operations. But what we are seeing on ground in India, as well as some limited experience in the Southeast Asian region, is that corporates are particularly serious about these issues, and they are doing what they can in the region that they are operating in to ensure that sustainability remains a top agenda item, and they deliver on their commitments, which is more important than making those commitments. Speaking particularly from a clean energy perspective, again, a little bit of numbers over here. The Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which brings out these corporate power purchase agreement volumes, showed that from the FY 22 to 23, corporate PPA volumes in Asia Pacific grew from 7.7 gigawatt to 9.7 gigawatt. And the forecast is that Asian region is going to continue to grow. Already we have seen growth in Asia and Europe, kind of superseding growth in Americas, which has been the leader in the last few years of this tracker that Bloomberg has been building. And what we are also seeing is that it is not just large companies who are, taking up commitments and, trying to deliver on them. Even the smaller, medium and small scale enterprises, who typically form part of the supply chain of large corporates, are also taking part in this journey, though they definitely need more help going forward. But at the same time, one should also bear in mind that there is a larger question about greenwashing and whether targets that have been set are actually being delivered upon. So in this context, one should keep in mind that corporates are trying. Not everything in terms of the policy environment, the geopolitics sometimes also doesn't happen to be in their favor. But given this context, I feel that sustainability is a big part of Asian companies' journey, and a lot of them are taking steps to deliver on it.
Thank you. Awesome, Deepak. Now I'm going to turn to Pak Benny. Who are the primary actors that shape the current energy policy in Asia? And how much does the state or the government decide things compared to the private sector, Pak Benny?
Thank you, Clarinda. Thank you for having me in the discussion. As we know that in many Asia countries and the Southeast Asia countries, the states retain significant control over the energy sector through their state-owned energy and regulatory framework. Countries like Indonesia or Vietnam have a strong governmental oversight and intervention in the energy policy and infrastructure development. We do acknowledge that the private sector's role is growing, especially in the countries that are liberating their energy markets. In Asia in general, we've seen it in Japan, South Korea, but particularly in the Southeast Asia, we see how the private sectors are playing significant role in the countries such as Singapore or the Philippines. We also have seen the increased private investment in the renewable energy and technology innovation. However, even in this context, the states often retain a significant regulatory and policy making roles. And furthermore, as we're talking about that increasing the private investment, countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines are seeing growing private sector involvement in renewable energy projects, of course supported by the government policy aimed at the market liberalization. Commonly known is through the public-private partnership, where we acknowledge that these partnerships are crucial in developing energy infrastructure, with the private companies bringing in capital and expertise. While the states remain the primary actor in the shaping energy policy in many countries in the region, there is noticeable trends toward increased private sector involvement. Again, particularly on the renewable energy sectors and technological innovation. The balance of the powers vary across the region, with some countries maintaining strong government control, but the others is also embracing a more market-driven approach.
Thank you, Pak Benny. While you also already talked about the public and private sectors are as the key or important actors in this landscape, I would like to ask to Justin, from your perspective as financiers, how closely are the economic and the decarbonization goals linked in a country context? Like, how can the private sectors decarbonize without the pursuit of net zero targets becoming a liability for companies?
Yeah, and thank you for the question and for having me on the podcast. Really a pleasure to be here with everyone. You know, the decarbonization goals of a country, particularly in Asia, is very much linked to its economic trajectory, right? There is no sort of decarbonization unless the whole economy essentially is mobilized and transformed in some way. Right? It doesn't happen separately in isolation. It's not a side project. It is the economic plan of your country if you have a decarbonization pathway. And of course, the key is to make sure that a decarbonization or net zero pathway also creates economic growth and opportunity, and the private sector is able to continue to thrive in this sort of environment. And I think that's what public policy needs to sort of, make sure that is sort of aligned and enables that to happen. I think in Asia, this is particularly an important issue. Of course, there's a very diverse set of countries in Asia, but the state tends to play an important role in economic development, or has played and continues to play an important role in economic development in all of these countries. Therefore, it will have an important role to play in its decarbonization goals as well. So take a few examples, right? If you see China, for example, right, as a country that has probably been the most successful in the world in terms of scaling up renewable energy, both in terms of deploying wind and solar and electric vehicles, but also building a manufacturing industry and supply chain around it. This has been a topic of quite a bit of discussion in the media, but clearly favorable government policies over the past decade has enabled that to happen. And I think that's been the case for many other countries as well. And if we look at Southeast Asia, right, many of the energy companies are state-owned companies, very much tied to the national economic development of that country, very much tied to energy security and many other, social economic context issues. These companies need to play an important role in hitting net zero targets and finding a way to continue to provide affordable but clean energy in these countries. So that is definitely something that the public sector or the government needs to play a role in that. And at the same time, I think for private companies, clearly they need to be mobilized to see a business case in doing so, and only in that way can they actually, scale a lot of these technologies, make them commercially viable, and then we can sort of, see the levels of investment that we need to see to achieve the net zero goals that we've set out to achieve.
So, Deepak, if we compare that with your perspective as more as the neutral and non-profit organization in India, as one of the thriving country with a lot of private sectors that now already submitting to SBTi and so on, and you mentioned that a lot of companies already doing the sustainability measures. Do you think that these private sectors actually decarbonize and also gaining the economic benefit out of it?
Yes. So one of the driving forces for adopting decarbonization measures, particularly renewable energy, is cost. So in India, we have a system where there is something called a cross-subsidy mechanism, wherein commercial and industrial consumers are charged a higher tariff than the average rate. So let's say if the average rate is 4, the commercial guys and the industrial guys are charged at 6 or 7 or sometimes even 9 and 10 rupees per unit of electricity. And this cross-subsidizes a lot of poorer residential segments, agricultural consumers. So there's a system which has been in place. And every year, given the fuel price variations, costs that utilities, companies are always finding that their tariff is only growing higher and higher. Whereas if they get into contracts with renewable energy companies, for instance, whether it is an on-site solar project on their roof, what they are seeing is that there may be some initial investment that they have to make if they go with one particular model, but then they are locked into a particular price and they start to see the savings from day one. There are other models wherein companies called RESCOs, that is renewable energy service companies, come and set these panels on your roof, supply electricity like another utility, and your power purchase costs are effectively deferred. This also applies if companies were looking at energy efficiency interventions. Since we, clean solutions, we want to look at both energy efficiency and renewables. Even in energy efficiency, we are finding these models come in where, there is a service company that comes in, makes the investments, enters into an agreement with you to, offset your savings against the bill, and they earn their revenue. So that is a significant driver for companies. Apart from that, there are also regulatory mandates. If you are a corporate who is procuring, say, thermal electricity from, through private contracts, then some share of renewable purchase obligation has to be met. At the same time, new rules like CBAM are slowly seeping in, though they are concentrated on specific sectors, and also their applicability is not sure of when it will actually kickstart in full. So such regulatory measures, the company's own desire to be seen as a organization that adheres to the fight against climate change and wants to be seen as the leader. So these are some of the drivers, but without the savings that renewable energy offers, I'm not sure the momentum would have picked up so much. So definitely people who have implemented are seeing savings.
You mentioned a lot of very interesting examples from India regarding I would say it's as cost incentives that incentivize these companies to transition and gain the economic benefit out of it. But I'm curious, Pak Benny, do you see these trends as cost incentives already applies in many ASEAN countries right now? Or do you see it's still a challenge for many ASEAN countries?
Indeed, it's still a challenge for many in the Southeast ASEAN country. cost is always, I mean, in any time they have a kind of discussion with private sectors, cost, the investment is always come on top of it. It's not oversimplified that the money doesn't exist, but there's a lot of barrier being highlighted that hampers the opportunities on this cost. Fall into four aspects in the issue of the ease of doing the business. Many private or manufacturers consistently cite political and economic stability as a foundation for investment they made, and then also the effectiveness of the process, such as import, export, is also very critical. Mm-hmm. And then also in the issue of the availability of the low-cost production, effective logistics system, as well as access to export markets. But then this is just a sum up that how the cost of investment indeed critical barriers for accelerating the clean energy transition.
Thank you, Pak Benny. I'm interested about Justin's perspective for these questions. Do you think the cost is still a challenge for most of these ASEAN countries, or do you think there are other challenges like Pak Benny mentioned as well?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, right? So I think from a first principles, with any company pursuing a sustainable solution or decarbonization solution, I think it's quite important to set goals and have ambitions, and then also try to align it with your overall business strategy, right? So you don't want to view it as sort of a separate side show. You want it as your sort of main business strategy, and clearly you also wanted to have a strong business case for doing so, right? Often the example that Deepak, you mentioned in India about procuring clean energy actually is a cost-saving measure, right? Who wouldn't want to secure affordable clean energy for a long period of time at a low price, right? I mean, I think a strong business case to do that will of course always be favorable to a company. But having said that, I think for instance in Southeast Asia, but also in some other places, often this is not, there are various distortions, let's say, in the market or in the system that maybe cause this not to align your incentives, right? So for instance, we can say clean energy is very cheap, very affordable, but for various reasons, let's say the cost of capital or cost of financing these countries is higher than in other places, and clean energy clearly is different from fossil fuels in that you have to have a lot more upfront capital investment, right? And you have zero operating costs or low operating costs, but you have a lot of upfront costs. So cost of capital is a big issue in these emerging countries, and that's this gets talked about a lot in various international forums. But also I think it's one of the issues we address in the CSP as well. But clearly this is what one thing is holding back. Others, such as whether you have the right incentives in place for renewable energy to kind of achieve its potential, right? Whether they have access to the grid and companies are allowed to procure it at a good price, whether there's subsidies for fossil fuels that also distort the market. So I think a lot of these things will ultimately distort the fundamentals of if it were purely competitive between, let's say, decarbonization sources and other things. Some of these issues might distort it. And secondly, I think clean energy is well known. I think it's a scalable solution. There are others emerging technologies that we may need to deploy for decarbonization that are higher cost and more risky, right, and less sort of well tried, for instance. And that may need a bit of a kick or a boost from the beginning. And that again is either we need policy to help that, we need philanthropic funding or sort of development fund, something to kind of kickstart that as well, right? So I think depending on the solution, there are certain applications, certain solutions that we must apply, and of course we have to sort of have a level playing field for everything as well as they scale.
Sounds also optimism about the challenge that we currently facing in terms of the cost, the technologies, and maybe the leadership or the willingness from each countries. So with that in mind, what will be your thoughts? And this is for all the panelists, actually. What are your thoughts on how these Asian countries, China, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, can achieve their clean energy goals in the future? What potential solutions do you see for progressing forward? Maybe I'll start from Deepak.
Sure. Thanks, Inda. So the potential is varied because one, there is the technological front where right now a lot of solutions are focused on solar PV, wind. Then on the thermal side, to a limited extent, solar thermal has come in, biogas is there. But we are also talking about newer forms of energy or vectors like green hydrogen, offshore wind is picking up. So those are also opportunities which both governments and the private sector would try to tap going forward. So that is one. Second, of course, is the market innovations and mechanisms. For example, speaking from the Indian context, yes, we do have, again, differing solutions across different states focused on rooftop solar, direct open access contracting with renewable energy generators. But a larger green tariff market or a virtual power purchase agreement market, the likes of which we are seeing in Europe or US, those are yet to take off here. So that would be one other. And third, I believe that, large corporates will figure a way out. They have strong financial backing, and clean energy suppliers actually will queue up to provide solutions to them. But it is the smaller MSMEs which definitely still need capacity, and support to, participate in this clean energy transition. So I feel tackling these challenges and, helping companies along with, of course, other consumers is what is going to help these markets grow.
Thank you, Deepak. And maybe Pak Benny?
So maybe I just talk about the two countries in the Southeast Asia region, start with the Vietnam. I mean, we have seen that how Vietnam is making history as the fastest country in the Southeast Asia region in bringing renewable energy, particularly in solar and wind, into their energy system. So a lot of the policy framework incentive to being put in place, we translated into the success of the Vietnam in skyrocketing their renewable energy mix. But then we also need to recognize the challenge that currently Vietnam is experiencing, where they needs to do more on the grid enhancement integration. Upgrading the national grid has become very crucial now to support the higher levels of renewable energy. Upgrading the national grid has become necessary to cope with the aspiration, the ambition for Vietnam to bring clean energy more into the system. Investing in the grid infrastructure to reduce transmission loss and improve reliability will ensure a stable and efficient energy supply. And of course, all of it need high investment. So this is where the public-private partnership and international cooperation become also very crucial. Because fostering partnership between the public and private, as we discussed earlier, will drive this progress. And the same case happening in Indonesia, then how public and private partnership will play significant roles in so-called awakening the sleeping giant. Indonesia, as we know, that has a tremendous potential on the clean energy. They have hydro, geothermal, solar, wind, which referring to many data that we have is still a tiny portion of it that being utilized. While at the same time, we also recognize that over half of the country is still relying heavily on the fossil fuels, and over half the coal-fired power plant in Indonesia is less than 10 years. So there is massive effort for the waking in the Indonesia to transitioning away from the fossil fuels to clean energy direction, which require detailed strategic assessment to ensure and minimizing the risk of the stranded assets, jobs losses, and economic impact. But what the other potential solution is also beyond the border of the country itself. Right. So, in Southeast Asia region, we are embracing the regional integration through the ASEAN power grids, with help with escalated the process of the energy transition in the region. the spirit under the ASEAN Power Grid, so that way we can optimize resource and matching with the demand. This will help the countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, and that country in the ASEAN region to progressively achieve their clean energy goals in the future.
I noticed two different angles between Deepak and Pak Benny here. Is Deepak talking more about the demand interventions, like how we can grow the market and also helping the smaller SMEs. And Pak Benny raised a really great point regarding the supply side of the energy itself, upgrading the grid, and also how in the future solutions, ASEAN Power Grid is one of the growing emerging topic. Not emerging, it's been years, but it's a continuously growing topic in the region. And Justin, if you may add about how these countries can achieve their clean energy goals in the future and what are the potential solutions moving forward.
Yeah, I think Deepak and Pak Benny covered quite well, I think, some of the main points. I think all four countries are quite different. If you look at China, it pretty much will, probably the only country that will either hit or overachieve its, clean energy goals, which it set itself. Actually, I think it's the only one that will achieve this, the so-called 3 times renewable energy by 2030, right? Which was set out by the COP28 agreement. India, obviously, Deepak has mentioned, also has actually done a tremendous job at scaling renewable energy. And we see, obviously, developments in Vietnam and Indonesia as well, though I think slower in these two countries due to some of the reasons that we mentioned earlier around deployment, cost of capital, and policies, and still a lot of subsidies for fossil fuels in these countries. I think one other question maybe I'll just touch on briefly is, while clean energy is scaling in these countries, all four are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, primarily coal, right? And each actually have quite a bit of it. Actually, all four are still building coal-fired power plants, right? Even though some have set end dates for when that would happen, but all four are still building them. So there is this sort of big question out there that, even as we are scaling up renewable energy, all four are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And I think to kind of get around that, right? So, not only to hit your clean energy targets, but how do you take a holistic approach to decarbonize your energy system, right? That requires, I think, quite a bit of planning and sort of long-term thinking about the energy system. Maybe some tough choices and big decisions to be made, right? About how you transform the way that you supply sort of electricity and power in all these countries. And there are a lot of technological solutions out there to allow that to happen, but to actually deploy them at scale and sort of get it to the level that we need to see, that's still very much a work in progress.
Thank you, Justin. I think we already reached the end of the podcast. So if each speaker, Justin, Deepak, and Benny, if you may help us finish this sentence. So the sentence is, these countries will reach their clean energy goals if the private sectors, then you may continue. Maybe I'll start with Justin first.
Well, I think what we established in our conversation is that this is clearly a public-private partnership, right? There's definitely a role for the private sector, and I can finish that sentence for you. But I think the public sector needs to create this enabling environment and allow, a level playing field, right? Whether it's with the type of support you offer to different types of energy, creating the infrastructure that you need, the grid infrastructure, and the other things around it. But if I were to just answer your question about private sector, one thing I would push is to raise ambition, right? I think set your goals, but also raise your ambition and try to always work towards it. I think that's how we need to sort of think about climate, that we may not have all the right targets today, but we need to raise our ambition so that eventually we get to where we need to get to.
Thank you. The ASEAN countries will reach their clean energy goals faster if the private sector is fully part of the process. So I've seen that many countries in the Southeast Asia region, there's a regulated market where most of the private sector is only on the receiving side. That's going to be without really being fully involved in the market itself. I understand there is a lot of concern that if it's being liberalized, then the private sectors might makes the costs higher, and then because the energy is a very crucial part of the right of the people, then it may cause a trouble. But I do also believe that the private sector have a lot of innovation to bring to the tables. So if they are given a role to really be part of the energy system in the countries, then they will help the countries to achieve clean energy goals faster than what the government only can do.
Yeah, so I think a lot of points have been covered both by Justin and Pak Benny, but definitely the innovation bit is crucial because the initial investments that the private sector can bring in, facilitate innovations that can actually help reduce cost of technologies, which can help other segments of the society. So definitely the innovation factor is crucial, but at the same time, participating in the public decision-making process and share these learnings that they have gained through the innovations. And again, this is something we see a lot of companies do once they have successfully implemented something or scaled something up. They generally try to build coalitions, share their learnings, encourage others to adopt. So I think that participatory approach is also very crucial because, if these learnings are stuck only within one particular company's walls, then it wouldn't benefit anyone. So I think the innovation and the participation are the two key aspects from the private sector to help countries scale their clean energy goals.
Very much agree, Deepak. Thank you so much. As you heard, the 4 countries in Asia where CSP Energy operates are a barometer for the clean energy transition. Next time, we'll take you behind the scenes of WRI India's work to bring stakeholders together at the nexus of health and energy. That does it for this edition of Turning Up Clean Energy in Asia, a podcast series produced and edited by Daniel Becker with funding from the Climate Solutions Partnership. The CSP is a 5-year partnership between WRI, WWF, and financed by HSBC with a focus on nature-based solutions and accelerating the clean energy transition in Asia. You can learn more about this work and hear future episodes in this series on our websites, wri.org/initiatives/climate-solutions-partnerships. Thank you to our guests, Benny Suryadi, Justin Wu, and Deepak Krishnan, who made these episodes possible. For my colleagues at WRI, my name is Glorinda Wibowo. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to this episode on. Every review counts. Thanks for listening.